Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where we speak about the international relations and we explore everything related or regarding to security, international relations, diplomacy, and modern world. I'm Martin Zubko. Most debates about nuclear weapons take deterrence theory and non-proliferation rules for granted. But this interview challenges those assumptions and explores the contemporary meaning of nuclear weapons and also what's the concept of the nuclear weapons in our contemporary world. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Herzog. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Dr. Herzog is a professor of the practice at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, which is located at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. He is also an associate of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. In addition to being an academic, Dr. Herzog was previously a U.S. Department of Energy technical nuclear arms control official. His research focuses on multilateral nuclear arms control, nuclear deterrence, proliferation, and disarmament. I want to mention a book which is coming in December with MIT Press called Atomic Backfires When Nuclear Policies Fail. And Dr. Herzog is a lead editor of this book. Let's start with the first question. And I want to start with a simple question, but that simplicity is sometimes sophisticated. So let's categorize nuclear weapons in contemporary debates and why we can't speak about nuclear weapons as one concept, why the categorization is important for us.
So again, thanks for having me here. And I would start off with this point that I think that our understandings of nuclear weapons are based on the idea of nuclear weapons as these war-winning weapons because of the legacies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the casualties and everything we've seen. And I've, in fact, done some public opinion surveying, and what public opinion surveys will tell you is that around the world, in different countries, people will tell you that they believe that the use of nuclear weapons, a general member of the public, will essentially lead to extinction and the end of the world, which is not really how these things go. So that is the popular understanding of nuclear weapons. Now, I would distinguish modern nuclear weapons into a few different categories. The first way that I would think about them is strategic versus tactical and non-strategic. So strategic nuclear weapons are going to be your long-range weapons, which can be fired across continents, transcontinental, generally are going to be used against very large military targets. So large military bases, carrier strike groups, things like that. Whereas tactical nuclear weapons or non-strategic are going to be your shorter range nuclear weapons, which are designed for tactical, essentially warfighting purposes. So there's a distinction on range. And when we talk about tactical nuclear weapons, those are the ones that we're talking about in the Russian war against Ukraine. When we talk about Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats, they would likely be with tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. So there's a massive distinction between US, Russian, Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles sitting in a silo that can, travel 10,000, 12,000 kilometers versus tactical nuclear weapons, which, might be a very small gravity bomb to be used on the field. Now, those things also have a connection to explosive yield of nuclear weapons. And so the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 14 and 21 kilotons, respectively, each. So that's right, 14,000 or 21,000 metric tons of TNT, which is massive. And we've all seen the videos. We've all seen, well, not videos, but we've all seen the horrific humanitarian effects. We know there are still survivors generations later. There were children who were affected by radiation. There were birth defects. And those today, interestingly enough, would be considered low-yield nuclear weapons. A lot of today's strategic nuclear weapons, your mainline strategic nuclear weapon, is going to be somewhere between 100 and 300 kilotons. Compare that to 14 and 21 with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And some of the Chinese weapons even go all the way up to megatons. So we're talking millions of metric tons of yield. So you compare that to what happened in Hiroshima with 14 kilotons, then start talking about other weapons that are in the megaton range. And then some of the smaller battlefield nuclear weapons are, zero point 0.2 or zero point 0.3 kilotons. So there's a massive spectrum about what could happen if nuclear weapons were used. It's not, a single monolithic or homogeneous category. The other way to think about them, too, of course, is nuclear delivery systems. We often talk about a triad of nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons can be delivered from the air. You can drop a bomb from the air. You can also have an air-launched cruise missile, for example. Nuclear weapons can come from the sea. You could have submarine launched ballistic missiles. You could potentially put nuclear weapons on a submarine launched cruise missile, as has happened in the past. And then, of course, the other way to do this is land. So missile silos and also some small tactical nuclear weapons. Like during the Cold War, there were nuclear landmines, nuclear torpedoes, things like this that were eliminated in the early 1990s by pledges by the heads of state in the United States and Russia. Now, what does this all come down to if I had to put this together? A way to think about this is, are we talking about nuclear weapons that would be used, again, for warfighting? So probably tactical, probably lower yield, probably not going to be launched out of a missile silo and go all the way around the world versus those that are strategic for hitting larger targets. And there's an interesting distinction here because the ones that would deal with warfighting that are probably smaller yield and other things are the ones that are probably seen as being more, quote, usable, whereas the other ones would be seen as less usable. And it gets really interesting because imagine if nuclear weapons were to be used, sadly, in the context of the war in Ukraine, and it were to be a low yield tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield, maybe not too many targets around. The consequences of that could actually be much, much less than what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whereas the use of a megaton yield weapon today would be monumentally worse than what we saw then. So it's just a massive spectrum, and thinking about them as one unified category, I think, is really complicated. And we need to think for students and the public about how to educate to think about nuclear weapons as kind of a broader spectrum.
And also, I would add that this is quite useful for journalists as well, because sometimes we see those headlines like maybe nuclear weapons are going to be dropped on Ukraine or something like that. Then we see on TV those opening silos, and all those videos. And I think it creates sort of psychological effect, like, oh, we all going to die. That sort of negativity with the nuclear weapons. And I think this would be very useful if the mainstream journalists also explain to the public that what sort of nuclear weapons might be used in Ukraine if the things are going to be wars.
It would still be traumatic, but if you're
Yes.
watching, for example, in Canada or Japan or something like that, your grandmother doesn't need to worry that the use of nuclear weapons on a battlefield in Ukraine is going to result in them dying. Now, if this escalated into a global nuclear war and strategic nuclear weapons started to be used, then we're at a different place.
Can I have one additional question? Do we have
Sure.
any example of tactical nuclear weapon usage in sort of contemporary conflict, like in the world?
No. I mean, our only two use cases of nuclear weapons are, of course, are Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But then there's another question about tactical nuclear weapons that back before nuclear explosive tests were put underground after the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, there were some low yield tactical nuclear weapons which were detonated by the United States and the Soviet Union on their test sites. And they still leave pretty significant craters in the ground, and there have been studies on the scientific effects, and those are not great either. And again, the other thing I would say too, that I didn't say, there's also a difference when we talk about nuclear weapons, whether you're going to detonate it in an airburst or a ground burst. So an airburst up in the sky, what it's going to do is essentially going to maximize the atmospheric overpressure, the shock wave, and create more damage against so-called soft targets. But the long-term radiation effects are not going to be as bad, which is why Hiroshima and Nagasaki are inhabitable today. Whereas a ground burst that we talk about is something that you would normally do on the ground, and the interaction of that nuclear blast, the fireball, the other thing, with the topsoil is going to create a lot of these radioactive fallout effects and could make an area uninhabitable for, potentially generations.
Let's touch a little bit existential deterrence. We're thinking about deterrence, but I think we should also add few implications. So, to what extent is existential deterrence an after the fact justification for nuclear possession rather than a predictive theory? And how do Western assumptions about rational choice and sovereignty shape which voices are considered legitimate in nuclear debates?
So, if we think about the theory of existential deterrence, just straight up, what do we think about it? It is predicated upon the concept that one or a few number of nuclear weapons are enough to convey deterrence. And so, we can take it to any extreme. You could say that maybe one country, North Korea, in the very early days of its program, you develop a bomb, and if you have a barge or an ox cart to deliver it, that will be successful for nuclear deterrence. And I think that what happens generally is theorists of IR and policy analysts look out at the world and they see that something didn't happen. And then they say it didn't happen because of nuclear threats or because of nuclear deterrence or the existence of arsenals. And this is one of the fundamental problems with essentially causal inference dealing with nuclear deterrence. When you're talking about nuclear compellence in the way that Schelling thought about it, you're saying I am going to slap your hand over and over again until you do something. Nuclear deterrence, right, is if you cross that line, I will slap you, which means that if nuclear deterrence works, you don't see anything happen. And this in the world of IR gets us into some very difficult positions because you are essentially trying to prove that something caused a negative to happen. And so, in the language of causality, there are all sorts of potentially confounding factors. And so some people might say, why hasn't Putin used weapons in Ukraine? And they'll say, because he's deterred by Western arsenals and these sorts of things. But maybe Putin doesn't want to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Maybe nuclear weapons are not seen as having a high level of utility. Maybe there are other consequences. Maybe there are conventional alternatives. And the problem with existential deterrence is we tend to apply rational choice actor models in this idea of it's automatic, that because you had nuclear weapons, something happened. And I would say this, even if nuclear deterrence is working, which if you're a scholar and you want to do this, the way to do it is you probably have to wait a couple decades for documents to become declassified, insiders to be willing to talk, and then you can actually kind of causally identify mechanisms that prevented nuclear weapons from being used. And in some cases, it may well have been nuclear deterrence and fears of nuclear use. Not every time. There are confounding factors, as I mentioned. But even if it is working, I would say what about, for example, proxy warfares for warfare where countries, right, great powers during the Cold War, United States and Soviet Union, fund their ideological allies? Well, okay, maybe they're deterring each other from fighting in war versus one another, but there's still some level of arms sales and other things, and casualties have been outsourced to the global south. And then the other thing I would say is, of course, right, stability instability paradox. India and China can have, troops high in the Himalayas that are fighting with two by fours and brass knuckles and punching each other because they can't use nuclear weapons and they can't use firearms and they don't want a conflict to escalate between them. But there can still be this kind of low level conflict because of the stabilizing effect of nuclear weapons if deterrence works. So, what does this all mean? So, let's say that you believe that existential deterrence works. You believe you have the evidence. You think, in the future, the documents are going to be declassified. There's no confounding factors, and you're willing to write off the stability instability paradox and proxy wars and all of this. I would say we have a problem because a lot of these theories of deterrence and rational actors are the basis of Cold War era literature written in the United States and the Soviet Union by men during a period from the mid 50s to essentially the late 60s, early 70s. And the thinking of deterrence hasn't really evolved that much. We talk about Thomas Schelling, we talk about others. Now, today we have new actors. We have 9 states that have nuclear weapons. North Korean deterrence thinking, the same as the kind of rational intersubjective model of US Soviet Cold War thinking? I'm not sure. New technology, right? Artificial intelligence, speeding up decisions, hypersonic weapons, other things. And all of this does, existential deterrence, as I think you mentioned, it privileges certain Western perspectives because they are the dominant perspective. They kind of maintain academic hegemony in some ways. And then there's this subset, right? There's non-Western perspectives, which emphasize moral dimensions of disarmament. They emphasize the immorality of nuclear deterrence, right? Post-colonial perspectives on nuclear weapons testing in Kazakhstan and things like that. And all of those pieces of literature emphasize something else. They emphasize the idea of existential risk, which is something we talk about now. We often talk about nuclear weapons, climate change, and AI. And what the kind of hegemonic Western centric position does is it says we existed in a non-nuclear world. We had a lot of wars, great power wars. Now we have nuclear weapons pointed at each other's cities. So we're all safer because we've created these weapons and pointed them at each other's capital cities and they can be delivered in, half an hour or so. Whereas the post-colonial perspective and non-Western perspectives, existential risk analysis perspectives say maybe there's alternative causality to deterrence. And maybe the fact that we've created these weapons, these large arsenals, and pointed them at cities doesn't mean that we can, say that we are safe or not. So there's an epistemological question here about whose voice is being heard and what is useful. And so it's a very polarized debate at the end of the day.
Let's put another layer on this, and that's extended deterrence. How do you understand this? And can we have an example of it so we can better understand the real meaning of it? Because, the English language is clear, extended. We all understand. But how is it in practice?
So I would say this. Back in the day, when deterrence theory theorists were writing about nuclear weapons, they said no one would doubt that the United States would respond with nuclear weapons if there were a threat on, if there were an attack on New York or Los Angeles or, Hawaii or even, let's say, Guam or Puerto Rico, which I think those are kind of more dubious cases of territories. But there were questions about would the United States respond in the case of an attack on its allies. And so as soon as the Soviets began to have ICBM capabilities that could reach the United States, and there was mutual vulnerability with the United States, the French under de Gaulle said, absolutely not. And we don't believe that the United States would be willing to go to a nuclear war on France's behalf and risk its cities. And so we talk about this back during the Cold War. We talk about, trading Berlin for Boston and, other, cities which have the same letter. And so some theorists would say that France developed nuclear weapons because it wanted prestige. It wanted to be seen as a great power. I think that's part of the mix if we think multi-causally. But the other part is France not trusting extended nuclear deterrence, which is one of the reasons why I believe that France developed its nuclear arsenal. Now, extended nuclear deterrence has a credibility problem, as we saw. And not only does it have a credibility problem, you have to, if you think about what extended deterrence means, you need to find ways to make threats that on paper might seem incredible or unbelievable to actually be believable. And so that's where we talk about the formation of the so-called tripwire. And the tripwire is this idea of small forward deployments of troops. And if they die, it's supposed to cause essentially an emotional reaction in the United States among the public, among the president, which would trigger the use of nuclear weapons. So the US troops, which were based in West Berlin during the Cold War in the occupied German Democratic Republic, well, they were not large enough to take on the entire Red Army. And so the point of them being there was not to win a war, it was to die, because if they would die, it would cause this kind of emotional escalation in the United States, which helps to make that kind of incredible threat to use nuclear weapons to defend your allies credible. We also see this too with these idea of US forward deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, the B-61 gravity bombs, which are based in a number of NATO countries in Europe. And part of the reason why they're there is these nuclear sharing arrangements, that they currently remain in the custody of the US Air Force. The US president has the ultimate authority over them, but there will be consultations in NATO's nuclear planning group. And in the event of a conflict, that could be released by the US Air Force to pilots in the host country nations who will then deliver them on their own planes, which is seen to help make the incredible threat to use nuclear weapons to defend these countries more credible because their pilots are seen as more likely to deliver it. It gives them a political role and consultation in nuclear sharing. Now, I would say this. As I mentioned, extended deterrence has a credibility problem. And it's not just about tripwires and other things. So I recently published some research in the Journal of Conflict Resolution with Lauren Sukin from Oxford University and Alexander Lenoshka from the University of Waterloo. And we do this massive survey of publics in 24 countries. So US allies in Europe, US partners abroad, other things. And we see that what publics think and what their government thinks conveys credibility these days is really different. For some publics, it may be strong displays of resolve. For others, they may fear that strong US displays of resolve result in entrapment or drag them into conflict. So extended deterrence today is very difficult in the US case with such a large network of global allies and partners that are cross-regional and have different political interests. And the question is how do you carefully calibrate resolve and restraint simultaneously to keep your essentially coherence within your alliance and also display credibility abroad. And I think that this is an enduring challenge, and we're going to keep seeing it.
And I think this also connects to those questions that we are having regarding Ukraine. For instance, when we saw those drones in Poland and other countries, and some people question, so why do we have NATO or why do we have all those agreements if there was no action? And I think this psychological moment also comes to what you pointed out, that will there be that momentum that the country will use nuclear weapons covering the ally? Because people might think if NATO is not able to do sort of action response for drones, like we have like 3-4 drones and not much happened from the NATO side. So for the Russia, that means, well, we did something, not much happened, so this tells us something about the reaction and actions of the NATO in the military terms. So this logic, I think, might be also applied to the extended deterrence, and it might be risky, it might be good on the paper, but I think it remains questionable as a concept.
I've heard some skeptics of extended deterrence say that extended deterrence is this strange situation where the United States pretends that it will protect its allies, and its allies pretend that they believe they will be protected, and that conveys credibility abroad. I'm not sure. There's really a question in practice about whether or not this works and if it doesn't. But the thing about it is extended deterrence is the idea of these incredible threats to use nuclear weapons. And there's a large magnitude there. So if you're sitting in Russia and, if you believe that Putin, wants to, take the Baltic states or something like that, there's a question here. And the question is, if you're going to undertake a daring action, let's say you're not completely convinced by extended deterrence. Well, if we're talking about risk and we're talking about the probability of an event, this is an incredibly high magnitude event. So even if extended deterrence is not perfectly credible, the severity of a potential response, particularly with nuclear weapons, is probably sufficient for deterrence. And deterrence is really interesting because deterrence is one of these things, as I said, it's proving a negative to determine if something works. But then there's this other conception to it that you could potentially have a leader, which I don't believe is the case, sitting in the White House who never had any intention to follow through on their extended deterrence commitments, and it could be a bluff, but you never know, and the severity of the consequences of the United States following through is so high that it might never actually be challenged in practice.
And do we have any written agreement about extended deterrence so people can study how it's worded on the paper? Or we don't have that?
So I think this is really difficult. I would say that, if we think about what extended deterrence is, if you think about Thomas Schelling, it's the threat that leaves something to chance. So if you look to the Washington or North Atlantic Treaty and you look at Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, that is the basis for extended nuclear deterrence. And so there's that. There's the security agreements that the United States has with Japan and South Korea. You can see those too. But the other thing is extended deterrence relationships never say there will be an automatic use of nuclear weapons. This is flexible response. Maybe nuclear weapons are not a proportionate response. The United States reserves at the end of the day the right to decide whether it will use its nuclear weapons or not. And so one thing a lot of countries have done is they've wanted to build in joint planning mechanisms related to extended deterrence, which is, now what South Korea got a couple of years ago with the Washington Declaration with the United States. It's NATO's nuclear planning group and other things. But again, so you can look to those pledges on paper, you can interpret them at will, but the actual decisions in practice happen in joint consultative bodies.
Absolutely. And many times it depends what sort of leader is in power, as we can see when we compare, for instance, Biden administration with the Trumps.
Mhm.
How do you understand the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regarding the monopoly of the great powers in this? Or do you think that we need sort of update to reflect the contemporary geopolitical dynamics?
Well, the NPT opens for signature in 1968 after the product of many years of negotiations, and it enters into force in 1970. And one thing the NPT does, which I think you rightly hint at here, is it says that there are five countries that are designated so-called nuclear weapon states. And those are states written into the treaty. So people often say, well, these are the five permanent members of the UN Security Council because it's Great Britain, it's China, it's France, it's the United States, and it's the Soviet Union, and then later Russia. But the fact of the matter is that the fact that they are the P5 is not why they are the countries that are the so-called nuclear weapon states. There's a date in the treaty, which there was a date where you had to have carried out a nuclear explosive test at a certain point to be labeled as a nuclear weapon state. Had India rushed it a few more years, it's possible that India could have been a nuclear weapon state in the NPT, which did not happen. And there's good reason to believe that some countries did not want India to become a nuclear weapon state, which is a question about nuclear responsibility, legitimate nuclear powers, and other things like that. And the other point to be mentioned is France didn't sit at the negotiations, didn't take its seat. China was not an active participant in the negotiations, and France and China did not join the NPT actually for decades. And the other thing, too, is at that point, China's permanent seat at the UN in the early days of NPT negotiations was actually occupied by Taiwan. And so that's just the first point to say. But the treaty, as it is written, gives those five countries the right to have nuclear arms. And Article 6 of the treaty says they need to move towards eventual disarmament, although it's a vague clause. In return, the non-nuclear weapon states who have agreed to be the nuclear have-nots in comparison to the so-called nuclear haves get that pledge of disarmament in Article 6, and then they get NPT Article 4, which says they have the inalienable right to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, which is where a lot of the controversy with Iran and Iran's nuclear program comes in. And so there's a question here. If the NPT is a grand bargain between the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots, and there's a non-proliferation function, a disarmament function, a civilian nuclear energy function, the question is what do we do about the fact that we're now at decades and decades, more than 50 years since then, and there are more than 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world? So there's a lot of criticism of these five countries for not having disarmed. And we know that some countries don't accept the treaty. North Korea doesn't accept the treaty, it withdrew. Israel, Pakistan, India have nuclear weapons and have never joined the treaty. But there's a lot of countries in the global south who are dissatisfied with the nuclear non-proliferation treaty because they don't see viable progress on nuclear disarmament. I'll say this much. In the 80s, there were peak nuclear weapon levels of 70,000, and we now have 12,000. I would say that's a massive, massive change, although I think there are too many nuclear weapons left in the world today. And a lot of this has given rise to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is, a ban on nuclear weapons and the bomb with countries that are dissatisfied with the progress on Article 6, who they have a legal infrastructure to ban the bomb without the great powers being involved so far. And there are questions about, is this binding? Where will this go in the future? But here's what I would say about your question. Your question is kind of like, is the NPT an unfair monopoly and, what should be done about it? So I would say this. Point one is yes, it's an unfair monopoly. This is a treaty which has always been unfair, has always been a two-tiered hierarchical treaty. Now, but is it worthwhile? I think it's worthwhile. We don't see countries rushing to leave the NPT because of, for example, Russian actions during the war in Ukraine, even though some people feared a potential nuclear proliferation cascade. And why is that? Because of Article 3 of the NPT, which sets up International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards, where the IAEA goes around the world, does inspections, makes sure that countries are not diverting civilian nuclear energy to military nuclear weapons programs. So if I'm sitting in a country, a middle power country somewhere in the world, and maybe I have an enduring rival, I don't need to develop my own nuclear weapons because the IAEA provides that insight and transparency. So there are actually great benefits of the NPT to many countries around the world as far as cooperation on civilian nuclear energy, as far as letting them know that their rivals are not going to develop nuclear weapons so they don't have to develop their own, which is why we don't see countries rushing to leave the NPT. So my point is this. The NPT is a very useful treaty. It's very helpful. I think it's played a massive role in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons with the IAEA, with putting an international legal norm in place against proliferation. But at the same time, I think it is an unfair and unjust treaty. So there are questions. If it's useful, but it's unjust, what do we do? And I think the answer is that we need a return to arms control and moving in the direction of disarmament, because if the great powers forever stall in their Article 6 commitments, which it looks like, things aren't going well. Pretty much every nuclear armed state in the world right now is modernizing or expanding its arsenal or increasing the role of nuclear weapons in their doctrine. I think that this makes the lack of progress on Article 6 increasingly salient. And in the long run, I think, it poses potential complications to the NPT and its long-term durability.
From those powers that are that create a monopoly in the treaty, do you see any of them actively lobbying or promoting an idea of update? Or all of them are satisfied with the status quo?
Generally speaking, I see them being satisfied with the status quo. And the fact that all of them have rejected the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and its ban on nuclear weapons suggests that. So they're happy with being nuclear armed powers, I think, at this point. They're happy with, in some cases, for the United States and its NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, Russia with Belarus, they're happy having extended deterrence relationships to protect their allies. And so I don't see great progress towards an update. And so there's always this question where a lot of countries in the global south say there's been no progress towards NPT Article 6. And the great powers say, well, look, we went from 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world to 12,000 nuclear weapons. That's clearly progress. That right now has fallen into question as far as its credibility, given the current state of the world with nuclear weapons.
And is there any country that is aspiring to penetrate that monopoly? For instance, a country that has ambitions. I'm not speaking about North Korea or those countries, but for instance, countries that are thinking or they already having nuclear weapons and they thinking, maybe it is the right time to just penetrate this monopoly and be, let's say, have a seat in the club.
Well, I don't see a whole lot of that going on for status reasons. And there were questions about status and nuclear weapons early on in the Cold War when there were countries, Brazil and Argentina and South Africa that really held out on the NPT for a number of decades because they viewed it as unfair and unequal. And there were some factions in those governments and those militaries who considered proliferation on this status type basis. Right now, I don't see that. Right now, the countries besides, North Korea or Iran that, people point to, they say, oh, maybe South Korea or Poland. I think there are good reasons to question why South Korea or Poland would actually develop nuclear weapons while being under the nuclear umbrella. And I think a lot of this is just the result of public opinion polling rather than actual structural processes and governmental interest. It's also about saying this in order to get a firmer security assurance from the United States. But those countries, when people talk about it, it's not because they want status and they want to be a member of the club. It's because of the security rationale and questions about the long-term viability of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence.
So I think naturally we have a question about escalation control. And I see sort of two concepts here. The first one is that we can really control the escalation. So we have a credibility of the agreements, of discourse that we have. And on the other hand, we have overconfidence. that we think that we can, but actually we can't. Based on your research, how to approach this question?
So I think this is really difficult. And one of the questions about so there's a few things about escalation control. So one is what have things looked like in studies and in war games? So the first thing that I'll mention is I'll mention Russia to start with. And so war games and exercises in Russia result in the first use of nuclear weapons by Russia, where they plan these drills and exercises using Russian tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons. And then the belief is that the exercise is over or that this is a victory condition. So there is a belief, I think, among at least a lot of scholars and policymakers in the Russian context that the use of nuclear weapons will be this escalatory device and it may help with conflict outcomes. But there's no planning or scenario thinking or game plan for what happens if the adversary responds with nuclear weapons, what happens about escalation control, and more importantly, there's a huge lack of literature in the IR field on the concept of nuclear war termination and how do you stop this thing once it starts. And the answer might be that it can't be stopped. And I think that, a lot of literature in the United States context too, and in other countries, is often about this idea of nuclear weapons as war-winning weapons, or that the use of nuclear weapons automatically stops a conflict. And the idea of nuclear war termination is I use nuclear weapons and that itself will terminate the war. And I think that that policy-making perspective conveys an overconfidence in the controllability of escalation. The fact is, as far as a nuclear war and a potential exchange between countries, we have an N of zero. We literally do not know how this will work. And so I think, you talked about this question of risk and question of control and escalation. And I think there's this tendency among proponents of nuclear deterrence to go back to this concept that you mentioned of existential nuclear deterrence. And people say these countries have large arsenals. We haven't seen a great power war, and we haven't seen the use of nuclear weapons. So the actual percentage of risk is really low. And so I think that's important, but I also think it's important to conceptualize what risk means. So when I talk about this with students, I like to take it outside of the domain of nuclear weapons. And my point is this. We all know people in our lives who do really dumb things, right? Like we know people who will not wear a seatbelt in the car. We know people who will smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day. We know people who will sadly go to a bar and get behind the wheel of a car and go out driving. Now, the thing about people who do really dumb things is that most of the time they survive, right? Like nothing bad happens to these people. So most of the people who have a little bit too much to drink at a bar, don't wear a seatbelt in the car, 99.9% of the cases or 99% of something, not endorsing this behavior, just going to say that, things don't go wrong. And so they come up with this post hoc rationalization. They say, well, I did this action and nothing bad happened, so it was always safe to begin with. And this is not really how statistics work. And so for those of you who do quantitative studies, we know that you start seeing risk more when you start replicating and you start simulating things over and over and over again. So the difference between something being 99% safe, 99.1, 99.9, and 99.99999, right, is just orders of magnitude different. But a lot of risky actions you take, if they're 99% safe, 97% safe, seem really safe. But there are little things that you can do which minimize that risk, which take you from the 99 to the 99.999 in orders of magnitude safer. And we don't see them till we start to simulate. And my point is this, is escalation control and deterrence probably seem really safe because the percentage of safety attached to it is probably 99 point something something. All that said, what if we were to take the Cuban Missile Crisis between the United States and the Soviet Union and replicate it 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, right? Is the thing that kept us safe deterrence, or is there like an element of luck which is involved here? If we were to simulate the entire Cold War 100,000 times, how many of those times do we get out of the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons? And we know about all these different close calls where individual actors stop these things from happening. So my point is this: nuclear deterrence, escalation control, risk management are something which happen every day. There are little moves that happen over and over again. And it probably is pretty safe from a numerical perspective, but there are new things that are being introduced here. The first is there's an element of luck to all of this. The second thing is these new actors that we talked about beyond the United States, beyond the Soviet Union and Russia that we introduce into the equation, that adds more uncertainty into our model. That may take it from being 99.99 to 99.9 or something. And all these new technologies we mentioned, hypersonics, quantum, artificial intelligence, things like that, they reduce it further. And my point is that even if something might have worked, and we talked earlier about potential questions of inference and causality with nuclear deterrence, we're doing little things in the world which are actually making us less safe, but they seem observationally equivalent on paper because the safety level is quite high, but we don't know it yet. So my point is this: I don't think the risk involved in engaging with this type of policy and rhetoric is worth it, even if the percentage of nuclear war escalation is really low. If it happens, the consequences are catastrophic. So I personally like to think about alternatives and future worlds and things like this. But I would say if you are a strong proponent of nuclear deterrence, which I imagine that, many people who are watching this will think about deterrence and extended deterrence. I think that people who are proponents of disarmament and deterrence are thinking about the same thing: safety for their countries, safety for their families. And there's a tendency to kind of, you know, go ad hominem or to criticize the other person. But we're all thinking about tools to get to safety for ourselves, our loved ones, and others. And my point is, if you're a strong proponent of nuclear deterrence, I think that nuclear deterrence needs a little bit of a makeover from the Cold War rhetoric and thinking. It needs to be more accommodating of different lenses. It needs to be more accommodating of multipolarity, multiple actors, and of emerging technologies. Because again, I think your question is spot on. I think the fact that bad things have not happened yet has led us to become overly confident in risk management and escalation control.
And I want to ask you one more question.
Mhm.
We mentioned that there are, 12,000 weapons or something like that in the world that we know about. Maybe there are some we don't know, but it doesn't matter. But my question is, why do we have so many weapons, nuclear weapons, if, when you consider risk management, what about if there is a little group equipped with the latest tech that you can buy on the black market and whatever, and they can take one or two of those nuclear weapons and threaten other countries or targets or something like that. So I'm thinking about deterrence as a concept that internally it's also quite difficult to manage. So some students might also ask, why do we need to watch 12,000 weapons if, let's say, we need 20 or 50 to destroy the world? So wouldn't it be better to have one or two storages with, let's say, 100 weapons perfectly guarded instead of having 12,000, and it's a bigger risk that someone will steal one or two and might use in the future? How to approach this conception and this thinking?
So I think this is a really difficult question, and I think it's a good one. The first is I'm not incredibly worried about non-state actors getting a hold of large, new scale, new tech, nuclear weapons. I think there are material throughput constraints as far as the footprints of uranium and plutonium and other things. I don't think countries are selling the latest tech on the black market. I do worry about non-state actors getting a hold of nuclear materials, even hospital sources, etc., and creating dirty bombs where you attach a conventional explosive to these materials. You could cause massive economic damage and panic and fear and things like that. And difficult to factor that in itself into a deterrence equation. And I think we're damn lucky that that has not happened so far. But what I would say as well is, so this is tough. If you were to centralize nuclear weapons in 1 to 2 facilities, I think they'd be a pretty good target for conventional counterforce, invasion, other things. But this also goes to the Baruch Plan shortly after the Cold War, where the United States sent a party to the United Nations and said, we want to give the UN international control of the US nuclear monopoly and put them in charge. And that plan was eventually rejected by the Soviet Union because the Soviets did not trust the United Nations because they viewed it as too Western dominated and influenced. And they had also had spies in the Manhattan Project and were only a few years away from breaking the US nuclear monopoly and getting their own nuclear weapons in 1949. But I would say as well, part of the problem is there are different ideas about what deters and what doesn't. Is one enough? Is a few enough? Do you want to have superiority? Do you believe to keep your population safe, you want to carry out a counterforce first strike on your adversary's nuclear weapons? And I think sadly, this logic of racing for superiority and different conceptions of deterrence and different conceptions of safety has got us into arms racing across the board, which just totally accelerated. And if you think about what produces new nuclear weapons, one of the things that produces new nuclear weapons is, counterforce, developing more so you can strike your adversary's nuclear weapons. And the other is second strike capabilities and protecting the survivability of your arsenal. And so that brings us, for example, to the question of China right now. And China, for a long time, has had this idea of minimal nuclear deterrence, that it just needs to have a few survivable ICBMs that can reach the United States. And in doing that, it will have deterrence. Right now, China is on a crash expansion of its arsenal. And so it was probably going to triple its arsenal within the next 10 to 15 years, and it's moving at a pace that has not been seen before. And there are questions about, why is China doing this? And so I think part of this is the status question we talked about. It's about China being a great power, having an increasing global role and taking on that mantle and trying to push for some level of parity with the United States and Russia. But the other question is as US nuclear weapons have gotten more accurate and more precise, I think, combine that with better satellite intelligence and coverage and other things, I think its leaders have begun to fear the survivability of their nuclear deterrent, so they are developing more nuclear weapons as a reaction. And so we're at this weird period in time where there are all sorts of incentives and thoughts about the usability of nuclear weapons. And I would say, when you say, what if we had 10 nuclear weapons or 20 nuclear weapons? I think the ability to target the facilities, if they were concentrated, I think is one problem. I think that if you have 10 or 20, it would give a future player who rushed to get to the bomb much more power if they were to develop one or two as far as a kind of relative scheme. I think one of the most difficult periods in the world, if we move towards nuclear disarmament in the future, is going to be how does deterrence work and function at low numbers of nuclear weapons? So at 40, at 50, at 60 in the world. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, this idea of nuclear weapons are a continuum with different yields. And maybe having a couple warfighting nuclear weapons is not sufficient for nuclear deterrence. And then there are other questions too, right? And the question, if we're going to move towards a world of disarmament, is, what do we do to verify the absence of nuclear weapons around the world? And how does that work? And who would fund that? And I've done some writing on that myself. I think that a lot of the technical problems are solved, but there's really a question of political will.
Right. And I also read a few articles about that issue. And one idea that caught my attention was the biggest advantage of nuclear weapons is that you can't find them. And that's quite difficult, not to find nuclear weapons, because there are so many implications and so many instances that you can do it. So I think this is also quite interesting, that I think some countries, they want to hide what they really have, so you don't find it. Because
so the number of 12,000 that I said, right, is of course just open source intelligence. We don't actually know the true number.
Yeah, because I spoke with few experts and they told me it doesn't work that you are invited to the storage and you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, like how many weapons do we have. This is really difficult international negotiations, and then you can basically go to inspect, and it depends what you can expect, where you are taken and where you are not taken. So this is also the question, I think, that remains.
So I think that the intelligence that is conveyed by arms control treaties is pretty good, and I think the New START treaty between the United States and Russia, which extension will expire next year, has provided a pretty good window into the overall strategic nuclear arsenals of the countries, but has not revealed very much about the overall levels of tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield use. So I think that that is one thing, but it is a deliberate part of China's deterrent strategy to not engage in arms control, which would provide transparency about the locations and numbers of nuclear weapons, which raise doubts about the ability of countries that would try counterforce strikes against China to locate all of the weapons. So ambiguity is for sure a strategy.
Let's speak a little bit about double standards. And for this question, I think there is a classic example of Iran and Israel. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Iran has nuclear weapons. This question was ongoing because of the program, the nuclear program in Iran. Then, when it comes to Israel, you're thinking about technology, about the connection to the United States and how United States and Israel they cooperate in the military terms. And then you have countries aspiring or countries that are criticizing these double standards. So, in one sentence, who is deciding who can have and who can't have nuclear weapons?
It depends where you sit in the world. That's what I would say. So the point to me is if you're sitting in North Korea right now, you're pretty happy that you have nuclear weapons, while most of the world is unhappy that you have nuclear weapons. And if you're sitting in North Korea, you probably would not be all that upset if Iran got nuclear weapons tomorrow. And so I think there's a question of legitimacy here, and there's a large literature about this. A post-colonial literature too that talks about nuclear responsibility and racialized conceptions of nuclear weapons. And during the Cold War early days, there were fears in the United States about, quote, Red China getting nuclear weapons. And that was seen to have a racialized dimension to it as far as China being an Asian country developing nuclear weapons. And there have always been questions about India and Pakistan and whether these essentially brown nations have a legitimate nuclear arsenal in the mindset of Western scholars. So I think there's a racialized dimension which is very uncomfortable to this. There's an allied dimension to it too. If you go back through the historical record, I think that people will find that the great powers have helped their allies do things. So the United States has for sure known that Pakistan, South Africa, Israel had nuclear weapons before they were actually declared. And so there's a question of strategic alliances, which I think is the question with Israel now. And there is the race dimension. And as you point out, related to Israel, the official policy of the Israeli government has long been, quote, we will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. Now, what that means your guess is good as mine. But this runs into questions too, because it's not just about Iran potentially having nuclear weapons, which Iran does not. I think people tend to equate the idea of mastering the civilian nuclear fuel cycle to having simultaneously worked on the technical designs for weaponizing a bomb. And I think that Iran has done some of that work, but I would have doubts about whether Iran actually has all that technology mastered. But there's a question that goes back to our previous discussion about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and NPT Article 4. NPT Article 4 literally says the inalienable right to civilian nuclear energy you can also get technical assistance from the IAEA and other states, which means that under the NPT, Iran should have the access to civilian nuclear energy. And this leads to all the controversies about the Iranian nuclear program, where the Iranians say, we want peaceful civilian nuclear energy, we want medical isotope production. And then other countries say, hey, wait a second, we have this evidence that Iran has in the past done some work on weaponization, has not been transparent with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And so there's this huge question which I think is very divisive between the global north and the global south about nuclear monopolies, about racialized politics of legitimate nuclear weapon states, about the great powers trying to promote non-proliferation in a way that denies civilian nuclear technology to states. And so I think this is really a controversial topic. And it depends where in the world you sit, not just where in the world you sit. I obviously have different opinions than a lot of people in the United States. It depends, where you sit in scholarship, but I think it's a series of complicated questions. But for sure, there are double standards related to who is a legitimate nuclear weapon state and who's not. There are double standards because there's a treaty that says that the countries that have nuclear weapons should get rid of them while they're currently building out their arsenals. And there are double standards related to civilian nuclear technology.
In the movies, we can see how there is a suitcase or some sort of desk with buttons, and then you put a key or card and you launch a nuclear weapon. And this sort of like discourse or this notion is ongoing. And now, when we have a new technologies quite fastly emerging, like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, I think people are naturally ask, how is this protected against sort of misuse? Like, for instance, I can say, like, oh, let's say India has sort of older systems, so let's hack it, let's do something in the future. Some people even say your passwords and everything will not work because quantum computing is going to break everything. Then you even have email providers now claiming that this email is secure and it's okay for the future. So there are many questions regarding technology and technology, sort of misuse of technology for not good purposes, for to do ugly things. Based on your research, how is this topic or discourse in your community of nuclear weapons and deterrence?
So suitcase bombs are a real thing. They're not as, familiar. There are not very many of them. My understanding is that in the Soviet Union slash Russia, they may have developed about a dozen of them. I think that they were probably decommissioned, probably most of them with the presidential nuclear initiatives that I mentioned in the early 90s when the Soviets eliminated a lot of classes of nuclear weapons. But again, without transparency on tactical and non-strategic nuclear weapons, we don't know about their, kind of existence. But I would say this much. The red button for using nuclear weapons is absolutely not real. Someone does not sit at a desk and press a red button and that happens. However, the red button for nuclear policymakers and scholars, I think, is proverbial. It's a very useful tool. And I would say, you mentioned the edited volume with MIT Press at the beginning, Atomic Backfires, when nuclear policies fail. We have the red button on the front of the book. So I, even though saying it doesn't exist, am just as guilty of others as using it as an important, essentially, symbol of nuclear war. And so, when we talk about nuclear weapons, we talk about command and control. And one thing you'll see is when you see leaders of countries who are nuclear armed, making presentations, if you look around the room, you will probably see a military officer carrying a briefcase or a bag with them. In the United States, we call this the nuclear football. And essentially what this is an electronic interface with someone following the president around that has essentially the nuclear codes or options so that the president can access secure command and control and communicate with U.S. Strategic Command in Nebraska to launch nuclear weapons. And so nuclear deterrence is a system that requires the leaders of countries that have nuclear weapons to have access to these things. And so when nuclear weapons would be used, you're not going to, a congressional or a parliamentary vote because you may have, if something's coming over the horizon at you, 20 or 30 minutes. So it requires speed. And this has resulted in a lot of criticism of the idea that certain leaders cannot be trusted with the so-called nuclear codes, which is another discussion that we, don't need to talk about now. But I think that the idea of checks on launch authority of leaders is something interesting that people have considered. It's a different policy discussion. As far as emerging and disruptive technologies, I think that hacking the bomb is an interesting one. And in the United States, the documentaries and other things will show you that we tend to use these giant old like floppy disks from the 80s, which are essentially technologically obsolete. because they can't really be hacked. And so technological obsolescence may be one way to deal with it. You have seen North Korean missiles coming out of silos that blow up immediately when they come out. And this is the so-called possibly left of launch positioning where it may be that the United States or someone else has figured out a way to hack the North Korean missile coming out. So that's important. And I think that, safeguarding nuclear systems against cybersecurity, against quantum hacking, I think is another issue to deal with. Hypersonics, I don't worry about a whole lot. They tend to be, I think, get a lot of press, but I think, ballistic missiles have existed for decades and they travel at hypersonic speeds, and ballistic missiles are not really easy to intercept. So I think that hypersonic weapons are a little bit of a fear-mongering kind of press-released weapon, which I don't worry about. The one that I worry about is artificial intelligence. And I think that that's the big one. I worry about the integration of artificial intelligence into nuclear command and control. Um, and one of the things that I worry about there, of course, is the delegation of certain tasks to AI. So imagine if you want to have, a theater battlefield. So let's say the United States and China are at war. If you want to plan all the different options and strikes and things like that, theater battlefield management, even with electronic systems and interface, takes thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people doing logistics and management and war planning and coordinating things. Okay, so let's say the United States launches, heaven forbid, an ICBM against a Chinese silo and it misses. In the world without AI, that weapon may miss, and you take a lot of time to figure out what you're doing, take a lot of time to figure out, where will you strike next? Maybe there's an opportunity to de-escalate, and there's diplomacy and other things. Okay, let's throw that all out the window and let's take AI battlefield management systems where it's all kind of integrated. AI could say that silo has missed, right? The ICBM has missed the Chinese target. And so seamlessly in real time, in a matter of 60 seconds, 30 seconds, we're going to reassign the target to a submarine located off the coast of China. And that mission is going to be carried out in a number of minutes anyway. It speeds up the processes and it can do it automated in real time. And my fear is that lowers the options, like it lowers the chances for de-escalation and the human element. And my other fear about that is that, there's the question, of course, of false positives and humans checking. Militaries are going to integrate AI into their militaries, their battlefield management, and other things because it makes militaries more lethal. They're already doing it, they're going to do it. And there's a question, of course, about meaningful human control and human checks. And what do you do when you have a feedback loop when two countries have AI systems running one against another? So I worry about that. And the other question that people are not paying much attention to. I just published pretty much the first scientific article on this the other day in the journal Risk Analysis with my colleague David Allison from Yale University, is artificial intelligence and nuclear weapons proliferation. And this has been written off by a lot in the media and a lot of experts as people saying, ha ha ha, ChatGPT is not going to help you get to the bomb, and people don't think about it. I think that's right. You and I cannot just go online, start talking to ChatGPT and get a bomb. One is because there are, safeguards built into those systems. Two, neither you nor I has access to the capabilities to do uranium enrichment or plutonium production at home. Like we can't do it. There are actual material concerns, there are facilities, there are signatures and other things like that that will stop us from doing that. Okay, but let's think about this. The concept of nuclear breakout, let's talk about potentially Iran getting to a nuclear weapon or something like that, right? So you're going to need the materials, you're going to need the weaponization and things like this. Imagine that there are some boundaries on that you have some knowledge gaps. And weaponization in countries historically during the Cold War sometimes took a year, 2 years, 3 years to master it all. And there are all sorts of problems. Imagine that you have an AI system, and a lot of these open weight models out of China don't have the same type of guardrails on them. You have this AI system, which is open weight without guardrails. You have access to additive manufacturing slash 3D printing, which can help you make components at home, possibly attached to AI. And you're in a situation in which you can potentially do advanced centrifuge cascade modeling. If the supply chain makes it difficult for you to get parts, you may be able to produce those parts indigenously in a way that the International Atomic Energy Agency will not see them. And heaven forbid, you may be able to take already skilled engineers, physicists, designers, and kind of walk them through some of these steps to figure out things they wouldn't be able to do. And so my fear is this. My fear is that in the future, that more advanced artificial intelligence models might change a proliferator's calculus about getting to the bomb. What if it could cut it in half or make it just a few months? And if you think about nuclear proliferation as a game of hide and go seek, where the IAEA and countries are trying to detect people developing nuclear weapons, and the proliferators are trying to hide behind the scenes, right now, detection and verification are ahead. The IAEA is really good. We have satellites everywhere. But detection has been really interesting. Detection normally happens, like advancements in this, in reaction to actual crises. In the late 80s, early 90s, Saddam Hussein is developing nuclear weapons. After the Gulf War, when the IAEA comes in, they figure out what Saddam was doing, and that changes the infrastructure for how nuclear safeguards inspections are done. That's in reaction to a crisis. And the problem is this. If you think about verification and detection, it kind of moves in these steps, right? Like it reacts to crises. You need agreement in international bodies to incorporate into treaties. There's bureaucratic inertia. There's money associated with it. All right. So it's driven generally by international organizations and these incentives. Artificial intelligence right now is being driven by tech firms and commercial incentives. And your general purpose model that you design to be really good at a certain task may inherit latent competence in nuclear engineering, precision manufacturing, and things. So if, for example, safeguards, verification, monitoring are like this, and AI is moving kind of more exponentially or on a logistic curve, right now the verification curve is ahead of the proliferation curve, but they may get closer in the future. And so I think there's a real question here as far as AI and proliferation about what will we determine we can export control in the future? Can we do certain weights on models? Will countries agree on it? And in the instance in which we can't agree on dual use commercial AI capabilities that we want to control because they're so important for our economies, what do we do then on the so-called demand side? If we think about, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and security incentives and status incentives, et cetera, for countries developing nuclear weapons, we may need to think a lot more about these kind of straight up political solutions to do it so that latent nuclear proliferators don't find themselves in situations where they want to rush for the bomb. Because if AI in the future, and I'm not saying it will happen, in a decade or two passes that verification curve as far as proliferation, our technology may not be able to catch it quick enough on the back end as far as proliferation. Again, though, I'm agnostic about where it will go. There are questions about whether AI can actually develop this competence, whether it will be able to take on tacit knowledge. And so in the paper, we simulate six different solutions, six different potential worlds, all the way from worlds where AI does essentially nothing for nuclear proliferation to exponential AI growth, where artificial intelligence models take on the knowledge of entire nuclear weapons design teams and are available to be bought commercially on the market, which is very scary, but it's possible. And in all of these game theoretically simulated scenarios, what we find is if you want to head off AI-driven proliferation, the question about the political and the demand side that we just talked about matters a ton. But the other thing matters a ton too is this verification curve and this bureaucratic inertia. The commercial tech sector, Silicon Valley and other places, needs to be actively incentivized and involved in the production of forward-looking verification solutions that make use of some of these AI technologies for nuclear verification and detection. And we're not there yet.
And also, I have a bit worried that someone can sort of copy paste the engine of AI, isolate it without those controls, without the verification processes, and just develop it independently somewhere in the world that you don't even know, you can't track it. And this causes my worries because I know that when you use ChatGPT for many purposes, there is filter, there is algorithm, so you can't do many things because it's restricted. And especially when you study terrorism and all those questions, you can see this how it works. But if this is removed and someone is going to copy paste and sort of enhance the engine somewhere in the world, then I think there is a potential risk that someone can develop knowledge which will influence the whole situation. And my second worry is that what we have as artificial intelligence released for the public and what we have sort of behind the scenes. So this is also the second worry that I have regarding to artificial intelligence.
I agree. I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. And let me just say right now, again, my point is that, I'm not worried about non-state actors because of the uranium, plutonium. I'm worried about these latent nuclear states and changing. The real thing, and this is aside from our conversation about nuclear weapons, that worries me is about artificial intelligence and synthetic biology and the ability to essentially create bioweapons. And there are already these so-called cloud labs that exist out there where physicists, etc., medical technicians, whatever, can order a certain drug or something to be produced or synthesized in an automated laboratory chemically. And this and controlling these types of facilities and what AI could mean, even helping unskilled personnel develop bioweapons and things like that, deeply concerning.
Yeah, especially when the technology is cheap. Because what you need? A laptop costs what? Like 300 pounds or dollars or something like that. So you have few laptops, you have electricity, you have some equipment that you need, you can buy on black market. So it's not that difficult. I mean, when you study, as I've been studying like access to weapons and all that sort of science, I was surprised what you can do on, for instance, dark web and all
Oh, yeah.
those things. And it's unregulated. I know that there is FBI and secret services, they having sort of fake honey pods and all those things. This is okay. But there are so many people. I mean, I think I read article that the dark web and all that hidden internet is like 70%. And the 30% is what we can actually see and index. So imagine how much is hidden and how much we have.
Synthetic biology, nuclear weapon designs for latent proliferators, all sorts of things.
Yeah, I think we could talk about this for another hour, but unfortunately our time is up. So I want to say big thanks to Dr. Herzog for sharing his insights, for sharing his research with us. This is a fascinating topic. I think it would be great to have a second episode about some more specific issues regarding to nuclear weapons and deterrence. But I will definitely read the book coming in December. I will put a link to YouTube description for all your articles and works regarding to this topic. And I think that's great discussion. Thanks again for this, and thank you for being on IR Thinker.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.